This is Philip Crosby from Alaska this time. We are been a while since we talked. We took off last week to kind of catch up on some stuff, get chapter quizzes done and whatnot. But we're going to spend this week and kind of go back and look at the Texas legislature and wrap up some of the elements that we kind of talked about, kind of brushed over when we did it. It's been an odd semester, like I said, but we can get through this. But I wanted to kind of go back over the Unit 2 notes and use this week to really kind of wrap up those areas of the Texas legislature that may be in an arena of confusion and whatnot before dropping the new biweekly assessment coming up. And so we're going to pick up where we left off in the legislature of looking at the last thing we did is right here with the aspect of gerrymandering and kind of the shenanigans that play into what we do when we pick our own representative. And so not a long lecture tonight, but I do want to go over some of these elements of the Texas legislature because it does create some elements on just what actually happens when they go and try to what we call pass law. The passing of law creates an interesting element when we try to explain to people just why not a lot happens in Texas. From the outside looking in, it can look very kind of dysfunctional, and to an extent it is dysfunctional. The idea that Texas didn't really create a lot of opportunity to make law because they believed that they made law, they were going to have bigger government, because every law that's made continues to restrict your existence in some way or the other. So Texas really kind of developed a system that made it very difficult to pass law. As a reminder, we've got the Texas legislature, which is divided between the Texas House of Representatives and the Texas Senate. This is not to be confused with Congress. Congress is the United States federal legislature, and Congress at the federal level includes a House of Representatives and a Senate as well. So it's very, very important to understand the difference between the laws that are made on a federal basis or a national basis and the laws that are made in Texas. So what the 150 members of the Texas House do and the 31 members of the Texas Senate do, that does not stretch beyond the borders of Texas. They control the moral narrative that exists within Texas, and it's kind of neat. You can actually go down to Austin and see these places. Texas government is one of the most wide open governments. You literally walk into the Capitol building and go through a metal detector, and you can walk right into these chambers. We keep it very open. We keep it very much in tune with the people, and this could be good, it could be bad, but it is a very democratic form of government. The legislative meetings are one of the more unique elements of the Texas legislature. We have what's called a biennial session, which means we actually meet every second year. Outside of what's called special sessions, which are impromptu meetings, they're called as they're needed, and the governor is the only one that can call one, by the way. Outside of those special sessions, we really only have this 140-day limit that happens every other year. And so there really is a time crunch that happens with the legislature. We don't have a continuous legislature or what's called a permanent legislature. Our legislative assembly kind of gets voted in November, and after that November election, they're sworn in January, and they have 140 days to get everything they need to do done. And if they don't get it done, they may not get the chance to do anything else. Like I said, if a governor calls a special session, only the governor can call one, and the governor sets the agenda for them. So even if they're called back into a special session, they're called in only to do kind of what the governor wants them to do. Now, they don't have to do exactly what the governor wants them to do, but they have to address the item that the governor wants them to address. But those special sessions are limited to just 30 days as well. And so, along with all of the other restrictions that we place on the Texas legislature, we place this time restriction as well to make sure that they prioritize. And the idea is, if they only have 140 days, then they have to decide what's most important to get done and only focus on those things that are most important. So when a lot of people are like, well, Texas isn't concerned about this or this or this or this, that may be accurate. The whole notion of Texas isn't concerned. It's not necessarily that it's not an important item, but if they had to list all the things they can get done in 140 days, a lot of times some really important items just don't get above that list of what could reasonably be done in that 140 days. In other words, because they have to prioritize, some notably important things are going to drop off. And this is just part of the design of the Texas system. So it's important to kind of wrap our heads around the uniqueness of the design. And sometimes the frustration that we have with the Texas system is more a frustration with the design more than anything that they're specifically doing. And this is me actually in the Texas Capitol building. This is underneath what's called the rotunda or the dome. And yes, I have been there historically. I've taken student groups there. It's actually quite an interesting place. And like I said, they literally will let you walk right in if you ever want to go into it. So this bicameralism, along with the 140 days, bicameralism simply means two houses. Two houses, two chambers. Sorry, my pen is one. I've got to push down really hard. Two houses. And the idea of this one is to retard the process, to slow it down even further. So not only do we give 140 days, but then we have to make everything go through two different sessions or two different houses of thought, debate, argument, and all kinds of shenanigans can happen in these houses. The biggest thing to kind of keep in mind when you look at these houses is the leadership. The Speaker of the House is the leader of the House of Representatives, and it's actually Lieutenant Governor that is the leader of the Senate. And this is really kind of important because the Speaker of the House is elected from within. So of the 150 members of the House of Representatives, the first item they do, or one of the first items they do, is they get together and they vote. They vote for who is going to be Speaker of the House, and you want to be on the right side of that vote. If you vote against the person who wins Speaker, you could be penalized because of all the powers that the Speaker has. You want to make sure that you are shown supporting the right person. And so from the get-go, we have all of these things that are going to slow down legislation, that are going to retard legislation, and some of the early decisions that are made are highly partisan, highly politicized decisions that really start already setting the tone of what this legislative assembly is going to be like. Many times we can tell very quickly what to reasonably expect from the legislative assembly simply based on how this vote goes. If we have a contentious House vote with a lot of kind of internal divides and partisan shenanigans, it's an indication that the session is probably going to be pretty tumultuous. If we have a pretty easygoing House vote where they kind of get together and it's pretty clear who the winner is, and there's a consensus on the winner, that's an indication that at least within a party there's consensus, and we may see an ease of flow with some of the things that get through. Qualifications in the book, I'm not going to go over them. They're pretty standard, but really low. Really not high qualifications. This is one of my pet peeves. I really do think we need to increase these dramatically. Overwhelmingly, the qualifications for passing law, passing moral standards have not kept up with the times. Texas Senate's a little bit different because Lieutenant Governor leads the Senate. Lieutenant Governor is going to be elected in a statewide election. So the senators themselves don't have any say in who the Lieutenant Governor is, which means the senators have to work with a foreign executive agent because Lieutenant Governor is actually a member of the executive branch, not the legislative branch, but then steps into the legislative branch to kind of preside over Senate dealings. So what you'll see is that the qualifications are a bit higher. The presiding officer comes from the outside in. And the other thing is we don't elect them all at once. Senators serve 4-year terms in Texas. And so what happens is half of them are elected every second year. All right, so in 2020, half of them were elected. 2022, the other half will be elected, and so on and so forth. And what this does is it allows for these 4-year kind of staggered terms to emerge as the senators are allowed a little bit longer in their session. So every senator is guaranteed at least 2 terms of a House or of a legislative meeting, whereas your House of Representatives is only allowed ever 1. Compensation is a big deal. It's covered in the book, but it's worth mentioning that we have this idea out there that they get paid a whole lot of money for this, and they really don't. Texas has the lowest paid legislature, or one of the lowest paid legislature of all the nation. Compensation is a mere $7,200 a year for the work that they do. So if you're elected to serve in the Texas legislature, you're going to be compensated $14,000, $400 for your 2-year term. Now, you can get $100 a day compensation when you're in session. This has been recently negotiated. I think they actually increased it a little bit, but not a whole lot, because if you're in session in Austin, good luck finding a hotel for anywhere less than $200 a day. Everybody descends on Austin. This really isn't enough to survive in Austin for the day. And even if we looked at, well, they're at $7,200, but they only work for 140 days every other year. Even if we took their entire salary and combined it based on an 8-hour workday for the 140 days that they were working, even if we did that, which isn't true, because when they're not in session, they have to meet with their constituents, they have to run elections, they have to do a bunch of kind of meet and greet and kissing the baby kind of stuff in order to secure their position. But even if we say that they were limited to the 140 days, even if they worked 140 days at 8 hours a day, if they were getting paid just $14.40, that would equate to something around $13 an hour. And so it's somewhat ironic that what we have is this kind of notion of people arguing that we need a $15 minimum wage salary or minimum wage hourly wage, when our own legislatures don't even get paid what they're demanding. We need to set minimum wage allowance. And so when you start looking at this, there is a per diem allowance. So if they are in Austin for like living expenses, that's what I was saying earlier, they are allowed a certain per diem to take care of food and shelter and whatnot. That is the case. However, like I said, it's going to be very, very difficult to do that if you're actually looking at the session. So you're looking at a legislative body that makes roughly $100 a day in Austin, which really doesn't cover. Now, they do the per diem to help cover that, but now you're looking at $228 a day in Austin to try to cover all expenses, and including your salary, and so whatnot. So there is an argument that there is a nice pension possible, but there's a lot of memes out there on Facebook that says, well, once they've been elected, they get a pension their entire life and they get full pension. That's not true. The Texas retirement system works on any public system, so you have to become vested. Once you're vested, you still have to wait to retirement age, and even at retirement age, you only get a percentage based on the years served. So if you only served 8 or 10 years in the legislative session, you're only going to get a percentage of your salary. You're not going to get the full salary. Now, what happens is it's a nice pension because with a little bit of sleight of hand, the law regarding retirement for the legislature, they actually tied their legislature retirement compensation to that of a judge pay instead of a legislature's pay. Because if you're going to make 60% of something, they tied their 60% of something not to this salary. They tied it to a judge's salary, which can be anywhere from $125K to really upwards $190K, depending on the judge, where they sit, and certain perks and whatnot. And so that's one of the reasons why the pension can be nice. A little bit of a law thing going on there. And so in reality, we think that they're kind of these guys going in there, passing law and rolling in all the dough. And in reality, many of them are sleeping in their offices, trying to scratch across, doing something they believe in, trying to do something within a very limited time, with a very limited scope, and without getting a whole lot of paid to do it. And so when you start looking at the legislate, it gets even more complicated. To legislate, we really have to look at what should the moral considerations be and how do we put them in writing. And if we're sitting at home judging the law, there's an element of judging the law that we have to pay attention to. Every law is going to take something, and every law is going to promise something. There's always a give and take. Remember, every collective agency, if you, the individual, are going to subject yourself to law, the law is going to require something from you because we have to have an execution law. If nothing else, we have to have cops and whatnot, and we're going to have to pay for those elements. If we regulate alcohol, somebody's going to have to regulate it. If we put speed limits in, somebody's going to have to monitor them. So every law that we have is going to take something from us, but it's also going to promise something in return. And so there's a trade-off that really should guide our understanding on how do we evaluate the effectiveness of a law. And this is a really incredibly complicated process because a lot of times the things that we think are going to happen as a benefit don't always necessarily take hold. However, the things that are taken in advance. So look at law as kind of something you go to Walmart and buy that does not have a great return policy. Once you pay for it, it's done. You paid for it. You cannot return it. So if the government comes in and says, hey, we need to take $2.8 billion and we're going to help kids stay off of drugs, right? Or a program the federal government called DARE, right? Well, they still took the $2.8 billion and they actually still, right, attempted to keep kids off of drugs. Now, the promise failed miserably. It just never manifested. And this is one of the issues that a lot of people have with law. It doesn't matter how good or idealistic your law is. A lot of times, the law itself simply just doesn't pan out. It doesn't... a lot of times, the promise of it, simply we lose sight of it. The actual, what we call the rubber hitting the road, the manifestation of it, really becomes complicated. And this is one reason why Texas says, because we do so badly at this backside of what the law promises, we should avoid the front side, right? In other words, the Texas kind of motto is, at the end of the day, it's better not to have the law than have a law that takes a lot from you and then fails to give you what the promise of that law was in return. And so Texas tends to kind of lean on this less is more kind of approach. We also have the biennial budget that has to go through the process as well. Redistricting goes through the same 140-day process. And we also have what's called administrative oversight, where we do have an impeachment process. So the legislature does have a policy where they can impeach members of the executive and judiciary. The book covers that pretty extensively, so I'm not going to, waste your time here. All right, bills and resolution, again, book covers this very well, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. This is really good in the book. If you have questions over this, don't hesitate to email me, message me. We'll meet with you live, and I'll kind of run through this, all right? This is probably the most important slide to go over if you want to understand the process. Remember, we've already added all the complications of the process. It's limited to 140 days. We have bicameralism or two houses. We have a very political system of elections between the lieutenant governor leading the Senate, the Speaker of the House leading the House of Representatives. We have all of the complications on the discrepancies on what are the morals, what are the priority items that should be kind of passed through this process. So all of these considerations already complicate the system. So by the time we get to here, we have this proposal of a trade-off. A bill is a proposed law. All a bill is a proposed law. Anyone can write a bill. You can write a bill and send it to your representative. They are there to speak on your behalf. So if you will have an idea for a new law in government, write it down, send it to your representative. It may see the light of day. I wouldn't hold your breath, but, it's worth a try. So what happens is a bill can be introduced either in the House of Representatives or it can be introduced in the Senate. All right. So a bill can be introduced here and start here, or a bill can start here, either one. Now, the only exception to that rule is if it's a tax bill, a bill that deals with revenue, it has to start in the House of Representatives. We actually took this from the federal government, and this harkens back to the no taxation without representation, where all taxation has to be directly through the representatives of the people immediately. So the House of Representatives deals with all of your tax legislation. So after the introduction, both of these bills do about the same thing. They're going to drop it into a committee first. Notice the House is going to refer it to a House committee. committee, the Senate is going to work, and the Senate committee rather. Now, the committees are where all the work happens in the Texas legislature. These are the workhorses of the law. 9 times out of 10, a bill doesn't get through the committees. It dies in committees. It gets in here, it gets kind of washed up, it never sees the light of day. And so a lot of times what happens is a bill will be read out loud, it'll be introduced in the legislation, it'll go into committee, and then it'll die. It'll never see the light of day. Why? Well, maybe the committee chair doesn't like it. Maybe the analytics on it aren't what they need to be. Maybe the budget on it isn't what it needs to be. Maybe the public hearings aren't as positive as they want it to be. Maybe it just doesn't get the support from the two parties it needs. There's 5 million reasons why a bill would die in committee, which is why most of the bills that are filed never make it out alive. This system is designed to kill legislation. It's not designed to really prop it up or make it easy. Why? Because we want to make sure that whatever gets out the other side of this process is the consensus of the state. We really wanted to avoid bills that were haphazard or whatnot. Now, even though that was our intention, we have seen a lot of really bad bills get through because they're rushed. Because at the someday, specifically the budget, if the budget's not passed within the 140 days, we have to call a special session or something. So a lot of times we do see some of the high priority bills get rushed through and we end up still having a bad bill. But the system is designed to avoid that. We just aren't very good at fixing and tinkering with the system. If it manages to get out of committee, in the House of Representatives, it's sent to the Calendars Committee. In the Senate, it goes out in the order that it got out of committee. So the Senate is designed in such a way where as soon as it gets out of committee, it's put on a list, and that list is taken up in full assembly in chronological order, right? Unless they vote to take something out of order. They can do a 2/3 vote to take something out of order. Otherwise, it's taken in the order it got out of committee. In the House, you have to get through the Calendars Committee. The House of Representatives effectively says that too much is going to get out of committee that we're really going to have time to mess with. So the Calendars Committee gets to prioritize and send to the top or the front of the list the things that are most important and send to the bottom of the list the things that are least important. So if you even get your bill out of committee, there's no guarantee it's ever going to be seen in the full chamber. So if it does, the last section of this is getting it through the full chamber of the House and getting it through the full chamber of the Senate, right? And like I said, this is incredibly complicated to do. Now, if you manage to get it that far, and you get it through the introduction, through the committee, you get it through the Calendars Committee, you get it through all the various votes that happen, you then still have to have your bill go into the Senate, and the House bill will have to pass the Senate, and the Senate bill will have to pass the House. Now, I'm not going to make you know all of your committees, but the big committee you do need to know is this one right here. This conference committee is the most important committee because what it does is if there's a discrepancy in the bill, let's say the House passed a version of it, the Senate modified and altered it, the exact same bill has to pass both houses, which means we can kind of take this back and forth and keep going House bill, Senate bill, House bill, Senate bill, House bill, Senate bill. Or we use what's called a conference committee, which has members of the House and members of the Senate, and they try to iron out the differences on a bill. In other words, they reconcile the bill to give us one consensus bill between the two chambers. That consensus bill has to pass this conference committee. If it doesn't pass conference committee, it dies in committee. If it does pass conference committee, then it has to go back to both chambers in full to pass final affirmation of both chambers. If it can get through all of that, then and only then does it go to the governor. Now, the governor can veto it, he can sign it, or he can unsign it. But notice this, regardless of whether or not the governor signs it or does not sign it, the bill will become a law with or without the governor's signature. If the governor does not want the bill to become a law, he must veto it. All right. So if you've taken federal government, there's something that the president has called a pocket veto that does not exist for the governor of Texas. The governor of Texas has to veto it if he wants to stand in the way. Now, the veto can be overridden with a 2/3 vote of both chambers. However, a lot of times the governor's veto is absolute because it's what we call a post-adjournment veto. Remember, this session only has 140 days to act. The governor is going to have a time period to act on every piece of legislation. If they're looking at this in the last 10 days and something is passed in the day 136 and it's given to the governor and the governor vetoes it on day 140, day 141, day 142, then it's sent back to the legislature, but the legislature is no longer in session. So even if the legislature could come up with a 2/3 vote necessary, they're not in session to take a vote, which means effectively that this post-adjournment veto means the veto of a governor after this adjournment is effectively absolute. So this is why the typical session, the first 60 days, it's really filing, organizing, really kind of setting the tone, getting some of those early things out of the way. The next 60 days, the Speaker of the House, Lieutenant Governor really kind of own the show. They're really kind of the movers and shakers of the next 60 days on what is reasonably going to get through the Senate, what is reasonably going to get through the House. And the last 20 days, the governor becomes quite powerful, but not because he has a direct say in law or can write law, but because of that threat of what we call that post-adjournment veto. What I like to argue in class is that the governor begins every legislative session with kind of like a Dear Santa Claus list of, in this legislative session, I would like to see this, and I would like to see this, and it really is written kind of like the governor kind of goes to the legislature and say, Dear Santa, if I got everything I wanted to, the legislature would pass this, and they would pass educational reform, and they would get this done too. And so the governor's kind of lists all these priorities on what he calls the State of the State address. However, right, the governor really doesn't have any power of making sure these things are done. They can ignore him. They can toss these things aside. So what happens is at the end of all this, the governor adds kind of a threat. And he's like, oh, and P.S., I have Rudolph. And if you don't do some of what's on my list, then Rudolph gets it. Right? And so with this post-adjournment veto, the governor can really kind of wrestle with the lieutenant governor and wrestle with the Speaker of the House to say, hey, I want some of my priorities done, and you need to get them done here, because if you don't get what I want done, I may use my adjournment or post-adjournment veto to negate something you wanted done. And so there is a ton of politicking and a ton of kind of personal animosity and whatnot that can rear its ugly head in this system. And so if all of those normal things don't kill a bill, we have a lot of other things that do too. The book kind of deals with this. I'm not going to go to in depth, but the filibuster is in the Senate when they just talk and talk and talk and talk and talk. And remember, if you have unlimited debate and can talk endlessly as long as you're on session to have the floor, the longest is Bill Ameyer, who talked for 43 hours. This can really eat up a lot of time. And the idea is if you've got 140 days in this session and somebody's burning a lot of time, it really forces to ask yourself, is this thing really important for us to pass? And so you filibuster to kind of burn time, to push it off, push the vote off. Chubbing is something used in the House where effectively the House members have limited debate, 150 members, they don't get unlimited debate. And so what happens is you use procedural tools. So you go in and you kind of increase and you chub it along, so you endlessly amend items and you continue to offer alterations and changes, and every alteration and changes has to have an additional allowance of time addressed to that change. So in a sense, if the bill is written like this, then you say, well, I want to amend it by adding this. Now you have to talk about what the amendment is and not the original thing. And so if you kind of have this endless amendment, you can really draw out the time. Again, if you have 140 days, that's a complication. The other thing is you have pure just what we call parliamentary procedure and tricks. One of my favorite examples of this is the Memorial Day Massacre in 1997, where Representative Arlene Wolgamoth actually effectively killed 52 bills in a given day on a point of order. The story is kind of complicated, but essentially somebody didn't uphold a promise. And so to get them back effectively, the way the story goes, she found something that wasn't done based on the text of the law. And so what happens is the morning session was sworn in. She rose to a point of order, and a point of order simply means somebody broke the rules. And the parliamentarian said, state your point. And she said, well, the calendar committee failed to specify where the meeting was when it set today's agenda. And by legislation, by the rule, they have to specify the where as well as the time and everything else. Since the meeting was out of order, all 52 bills that were on the calendar that day to be discussed were effectively killed off. And so what we see in Texas is it's a system that has a very narrow window of time to do it. It's a highly political system. It's a highly complicated system. We've thrown a lot of, kind of garbage in the way that prevents a smooth or effective system from passing anything very efficiently. And it really does create a system where not a lot is going to get through this system. And so a lot of people look at Texas and say, well, Texas is conservative. Texas is this. Texas just, they're not very good at getting stuff done. And the reality is not all that's exactly true. There's a lot of good people that are doing this very well. The problem is the system is designed to keep it from happening very effectively. And until we change the system, I don't think it's reasonable to expect them to do a lot of what people want them to do. Now, I'm not going to lecture over this next part because, let's be honest, listening to a recorded lecture is no fun. But make sure as you're reading through the book that you really kind of look into the Lieutenant Governor and the Speaker of the House to kind of look at what are their roles, what are their responsibilities. They are the movers and shakers of this political divide. The other thing to make sure you pay attention to are all the influences that happen. Partisan politics does play into this. You have to pay attention to partisan politics. And even if parties are divided, a lot of times the divisions within parties will be as important as the division that we have outside or between the two major political parties. In Texas specifically, if there's a divide in the Republican Party, it's a great indication on what's not going to get done or what's going to be complicated. If I'm looking at a different state, I would look at that. So partisan politics does play in, and internal party splits can do this. If parties are working together or if the Republican Party is unified, it's a good indication that we're going to see maybe that element that pass. All right. I'll learn how to talk. Budget allowance is another big item. Do we have the money? Remember, we talked about the money. We are a pay-as-you-go state, and a lot of ideas cost a lot more money than the state takes in. So what are the budgetary considerations? If you go in with a great idea that we simply can't pay for, it's going to get nixed pretty quickly because of the budgetary considerations. Public opinion. All of these are publicly elected officials. This is why you're not going to see them do something that's incredibly unpopular. It's very, very hard for an elected representative assembly to do something that's not popular. This is why we haven't seen tax reform. This is why we haven't seen Social Security reform at the federal level. It's why we don't see a lot of things that we need to see happen, because as soon as the representative assembly does something that's unpopular with the voters, they risk losing their seats in the next election. And so keeping kind of the public opinion in mind and allowing the public kind of to steer this session is another complication that we have to pay attention to. Special interest groups are powerful. Whether we like them or not, they are well within the right to play into this. They are trying to accomplish things through legislation just like anybody else. We cannot ignore them. It doesn't mean they're bad. They're very good at what they do. A lot of the problems with the special interest groups is we're not participating where we need to participate. And so a lot of times special interest groups are the only ones talking. And so it's important that we kind of balance this out with other interest groups. Really great point on this is when you go buy a gallon of gasoline, you give Big Oil money. Big Oil uses that money to go and lobby or try to influence legislation. So when we see oil-friendly legislation, my question is, well, you, the individual, gave the oil companies money to lobby to get favorable oil laws? Did you actually go and actually give money to some nature preserve, some conservatory? Did you actually give a $20 bill to protect the beaches or something like that? Because a lot of times these, if these are remaining in balance, then we have to fund the oil companies, but we have to also equally allow a interest group that's giving their counter opposite, their balance, enough of a say. Many times in politics, we are unaware of the power we give big business and the power we really deny these small kind of nature groups, conservatory groups, clean air groups that really don't have large budgets to work with. Presiding officer, Speaker of the House, and the governor's opinion, where I talk about those, all of these play into the legislative elements. And so a lot of times when we look at these big ideas, it can feel very daunting on, if I'm trying to do something notable at the state level, how do I actually get this done? And a lot of students ask me, Crosby, how do I get this done? And I'm not going to lie to you, it's not easy. Nothing about this is easy. A lot of really good meaning people go into the system and they quickly get out of it. They quickly go home. They quickly realize just how complicated this is. And the system is going to kind of be what the system is until we kind of alter it, change it, modify it. In my humble estimation, maybe we increase qualifications, maybe we increase pay, maybe we can increase the longevity of how long they have in office. There are things that we could do that could benefit the system, make the system better. But as it stands, I think it's foolish of us to pretend that they're going to do anything great anytime soon. The various elements of the system kind of require that what we're going to have is a rushed, kind of haphazard, very political element when it comes to passing law, which means most of the moral elements of our nation, or of our state rather, my apologies, are going to be based on a partisan thing. And what is our involvement right now? Not a lot. We don't contact officials. We don't discuss politics. We don't involve ourselves. And so we're kind of sitting back waiting for them to do something without really kind of wanting to involve ourselves in the process. Texas, as much as we say we have a people's house, we have a democracy, we really are poor at getting involved. But even as a nation, we just don't get involved much. These are contacted our public officials. So how many of us have actually told our public officials what we wanted them to do? National average 12%, we're at 9%. Even discussing government, what should the moral parameters of our nation be? The national average is 29, Texas is 26, which means roughly 3/4 of us never have an open discussion about moral parameters of what law should be. But yet we want this political system to produce a sound moral guidance without really kind of understanding how we get there or how complicated. We can't even discuss these things with friends and family, but we want them to go in a legislative assembly and kind of magically produce good law. It's just simply not going to happen. And so as we look at this, it's really important to kind of do this. Now, make sure you pay attention to lobbyist special interest. We'll wrap this up as we get through the week. But this is the only video recording I'm going to give you for the week. We've already done this part of it as we get into the budget and budgetary considerations. And so what I want you to do is make sure you're keeping up on the chapter quizzes. Make sure you're reading the more technical elements are in the book. The book does a good job of some of the more lame elements, but I do want to spend some time on these lectures kind of going through some of the nuances that really don't come up in the book or sometimes fall through the cracks. So until we meet again, this week, really kind of focus on bi-weekly assessment coming out. But until we meet again, I'll post another lecture by next week, and then we'll look at the governor and the